Professor Robert Thurman has long been regarded as one of the most consequential articulators of Tibetan Buddhism in America. He was also the first Westerner to be ordained a Buddhist monk by the Dalai Lama when he was barely past 20. Although he gave up monkhood in less than 2 years, he went on to become not just a lifelong practitioner of Buddhism and its sought-after teacher, but also one of the Dalai Lama's oldest and closest friends. As anticipation grows over what the Dalai Lama might announce on July 2nd on the much speculated question of his successor, Dr. Thurman, who is 84, is uniquely positioned to understand what the soon-to-be 90 Dalai Lama's options could be. Perhaps the rarest possibility is that the Dalai Lama may opt for what is known as Madhye Tulku, which in Tibetan means reincarnation during one's lifetime. There is nothing to suggest that the Dalai Lama would choose that option just 4 days before he turns 90 on July 6th to preempt any effort by China to hijack the institution dating back to the late 16th century. However, in so much as it concerns options before him, Madhye Tulku has come under some discussion. To understand what could be going through the Dalai Lama's mind, Mayank Chhaya Reports spoke to Dr. Thurman from New York. Welcome to Mayank Chhaya Reports, Professor Thurman. It's an absolute privilege to have you.
Thank you, Mayank. I'm very happy to be here.
You know, like I was saying, there are expectations that on July 2nd, the Dalai Lama will, via video message, make a highly consequential announcement about his succession. This is, of course, very speculative. But irrespective of what happens, what, in your judgment, should be the way forward for him to ward off China from taking over the institution of the Dalai Lama once he passes?
Yes, well, I think that he has already said many times that that will not be acknowledged by him, and therefore it will not really be acknowledged by the Tibetan people, although they can try to enforce it. But in the sense that they are already trying to prevent the Tibetan people from learning Tibetan, by that time, perhaps they are feeling that they will, it will be irrelevant to the Tibetans, which has always been their fantasy and has never worked out for them. So beyond that, what I think he promised to do in his 90th year was not necessarily to designate a particular person or being, but to constitute a committee that will definitely find a person to be a Dalai Lama who will not have a political role, and in that sense will be defined as a Dalai Lama differently from how he was defined when he was found. He has already, since 2011, as you know, resigned from having political responsibility or power, and he intends to preserve that for his next incarnation, which he always will say. He gives the caveat if the Tibetan people want one, which of course they do, and so they will. So he will only be at the Ganden Podang residence in Drebo Monastery, which is inaccessible to him, his residence, since it's occupied by someone else, and it will be in exile. And he has said it will be in exile that he will be reborn, since the whole concept of it presumes his ability to choose the family in which he will be born. So, that this ability is attainable by siddhas, by adept yogis, and that it will do. But what if there is something momentous stated on the July 2nd, it might be the chair of the committee, and it might be the fact that a lead person in the other schools of Tibetan Buddhism will be constituting that committee, because he wishes that the Dalai Lama to continue in a non-sectarian within Tibetan different schools. I don't use the word sects, in fact, sure. People do, and also it's even conceivable he would want to have people from other world traditions in that committee, and his ecumenism and his insistence on people not converting each other or competing for market, and religions not competing for market share, and therefore itself not wishing to convert people who are not born as Buddhists into Buddhism. His whole slogan of of keep your grandmother's religion, which he says to everyone, and he means it, and he has kept that line, held that line very, very carefully all along. And I think that whatever if he constitutes a committee on July 2nd, which is what I would rather imagine would happen, it will be that kind of a committee. It'll be, the only thing shocking about it would be the non-sectarianism of it.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. That means we are perhaps confronting the very real possibility that the tradition of reincarnation may not exist as it's been understood. Because if this committee is choosing a successor in his lifetime, which is likely, are we then looking at a wholly new tradition in Tibetan Buddhism?
Well, the Made Choku, what they call the Made Choku, who you emanate, you create an emanation before you have passed away. I would be very surprised if he does that. But, anything is possible. He's thought it through very, very carefully, I'm sure, and anything could be possible, but who knows? And if that would be earth-shaking, if he says that so-and-so already is the Dalai Lama, that would be amazing. And it would be a delight, actually, in a way. It would be lots of fun. Which is conceivable. As far as there being no more reincarnation, I don't think that will happen, in the sense that he would say, well, there won't be any more Dalai Lama reincarnations. In a way, what he's saying is that there will be no Dalai Lama reincarnation holding any sort of political power and political responsibility. That he's very, very determined about. He wants the Tibetans to learn the democratic skill of being a loyal opposition, so you can have a democracy. And therefore he's not going to be there to make decisions for them, is what he's saying. To mute conflict into where it's an alternation of power rather than a fight to the death over power. Which is what politics should be, such an alternation. So, which he certainly very much believes in. Actually, I think you can find its roots in the way the Buddha himself, Shakyamuni, constituted the Buddhist Sangha.
Right.
Which people don't understand, which is that in Buddhist monasticism, the abbot, authority of the abbot is much more circumscribed than in Christian monasticism, where obedience to the abbot and the abbot's obedience to some archbishop and then God, finally everybody obeying God, is not a thing for the Buddhists. So therefore, there are other virtues that are much more important than any kind of obedience. So the idea of the Sangha being modeled on a Republican kind of committee, like an assembly or a parliament or advisors to the king, rather than the king having omnipotent power, has been the tribal chief, having to deal with the elders and so on. I think it is said to be in the constitution of the Sangha, and I think that's correct. So anyway, I'm looking forward to July 2nd. I hadn't heard that rumor.
Yeah, and in fact, the current prime minister was quoted by some news agencies as saying that it's possible, not necessarily succession, but something of profound importance may be announced on July 2nd. So people are then speculating that it could be his successor.
I see. Well, that would be great. If he did that, that would be, I would imagine in the way he is, that if he did that, he would do that end.
Right.
If there was a Mande Troku, it would be to hold the ground between now and when a baby could be born and recognized, but that he would preserve the idea of perhaps a slightly a different kind of education and a different kind of relationship with the parental, instead of just banished and then the monks completely taking over, which is a little bit traumatic, I think, for younger incarnations. Right. And also, the other thing I think would be that it would, one of the reasons that the great fifth Dalai Lama feared corruption of the incarnation system was that an incarnation's household or estate would keep his wealth. And so the motive of his housekeepers, his treasurer, his chamberlains, and these kind of people, to quickly find somebody, and if possible in a wealthy family, to
Right.
enhance the state, if possible, even is that motive is essentially corrupting, even though it didn't always happen that way. And for example, he was picked in a sort of a modestly wealthy peasant family, but not a very rich one. And
Right.
so it was definitely peasant, reasonable middle class peasants household to the Potala, like Lord Cabin to the White House, like Abe Lincoln or something. It has its own form of that. So I think if you name someone already existing, that would be amazing, and that would confer huge responsibility on that person. But on the other hand, it would be a placeholder, I think, where he would say, I will also incarnate personally, and I will be found, and this person will be in charge of that. Because the Nirmanakaya idea, the Tulku or Nirmanakaya idea in Buddhism is that someone who is enlightened can be multiple incarnations, which actually is not too outlandish in the context of Hinduism, where deities can be multiple bodies at the same time.
Yeah.
Kind of
Yeah.
Westerners can think of it as science fiction or something.
Now, for those among my viewers who may not immediately understand, explain a little bit what emanation would mean to them.
Yes, well, what emanation means is that what a Buddha is defined as something not supernatural, but I would say supernormal is the better word for it. Buddhahood is where a human being develops an ability to sort of be everything, and I think the best analogy is because people have normally been in love sometime in their life, and they have identified even momentarily, completely with a beloved person, not just romantic always. It can also be a mother and child or a father and child, etc., siblings, or, where people, teammates almost, where they identify with each other, so that harm to the one they identify with seems to them like harm to themselves and so on.
Right.
So the human ability to expand their sense of identification beyond the whatever is in their own skin is magnified in the Buddhist worldview to such an inconceivable degree, where a being comes to identify with all life. And in that line, and also remain present to the presence of all life, and therefore be disturbed by the suffering of many of the occupants of all life, and therefore be able to respond to that vast register of suffering by being emanating actual other bodies that go to help those beings. Because you can't, it's like you would be, if you were the UN president, you would emanate blue helmets everywhere there was conflict, and put them in Gaza in numbers where the other people couldn't violate that. And of course, I remember years ago, angrily, I was in Malmora, actually, one dream that I had, where I was very angry with my guru, a Mongolian gentleman at that time, my main guru. And it was during the Bangladesh horrible atrocities going on. And I was angrily saying, where's that Nirmanakaya? Was this just a bunch of nonsense? Like, why aren't there peacekeepers out there stopping the killing of babies and all horrible things that were going on in Bangladesh, that you were in the Indian press, of course, in that time. And since there was no Facebook in those days, no Instagram. And then this teacher of mine was sitting on a bench on Cranks Ridge in Almora, where I was, and that's where I was in my dream. I was in the house sleeping, but my dream body was there. And then he didn't answer. He looked very grim, as I felt, and I was angrily upbraiding him. Where was the Nirmanakaya? And he was he just started getting bigger, the dream perception of him, and him bigger and bigger, and he pretty soon blotted out the skyline, which was Nanda Devi and Trishul mountains. He was so huge, and I was like screaming at his knee like a fly or something. And then I woke up, you know.
I see.
So it was my own difficulty in confronting that sort of inconceivable idea that someone could be multiple bodies at the same time, you know.
Right. You mentioned the next one being a placeholder while a new one really reincarnates. Now, can that placeholder be a woman, as the Dalai Lama has frequently mentioned?
Oh, yes, definitely. Could definitely be a woman. And he meant that. He didn't just mean that as a joke to the fashion industry, because I think when he first said that, he was in Italy, and he got in trouble because he made a kind of fashion gesture. So,
Right.
and but he wasn't comparing a beautiful woman to an ugly woman. He was just saying that if such a woman would be more beautiful than he was, you know, an old monk.
Indeed.
And so, so he wasn't being sexist in that way. But yes, that's of course totally possible in that. And he's often said that how leadership, he likes to see more feminine leadership in the world, because he says that the way women are socialized, and even almost genetically, they're less prone to violence as quickly as men. There's quicker in a crisis situation. There's an oxytocin release rather than a cortisol release. He's often said that, whereas the male wants to crash ahead and deal with it in some heated way, and the female rather looks to see the reality of the situation and where's their allies and where are their resources, and is a little more pragmatic in dealing with difficult situations. And therefore, he wanted to see in this era of the power of the weapons, the extreme power of weapons, he wanted to see more female leadership. So that's when it's in that context that he made that semi-humorous thing.
Right.
And Tibetans, who are no less prone to male chauvinism than other people, were not so pleased with it either.
True.
But it's certainly, in other words, and of course, you know, Avalokiteshvara and Tara are considered male and female reflexes of the same
Absolutely.
conception of old Buddhas. And even Tara is seen as having the miraculous abilities more than Avalokiteshvara, having the Shakti, like it's sort of similar to the idea of the female Shakti, you know.
Right.
So Buddhism has that idea too.
You were the first Westerner, Dr. Thurman, to be ordained a monk by the Dalai Lama.
That's right.
Yeah. And what was your experience before you returned to the life of laity, as it were?
Well, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed myself enormously. I had been brought by my first teacher, who was a Mongolian monk from Lomang, and who had really helped me kindle my total affinity with Tibetan, and I learned the language really quickly, and I loved the Dharma. I just was totally adored it, and I right away wanted to be a monk for life, and I was totally into it. And he knew that I was very sincere in wanting that, but he also foresaw that I was not living in a country where there were a lot of Buddhist monasteries in New York City in 1960s. In fact, zero. And in maybe a few ethnic conclaves, there was occasional bhikshu, maybe in Thai or Sri Lankan communities, but no Tibetan thing. He had his own tiny little monastery in a Mongolian refugee enclave in New Jersey and so on. And so, but I kept badgering him all the time, and he kept refusing to ordain me and said, look, it's fine. You live like a monk for a few years since you're very gung-ho in your studies, and that's all very laudable. But long term, it's not going to be viable for your mission in life, as you will discover what it really is, for you to be a monk in this society. And so on. And I wouldn't listen, you know, being an omniscient 22-year-old and 21-year-old, 22-year-old. And so he finally relented to the extent that he took me to meet the Dalai Lama on a trip he needed to do in India. Of course, being Mongolian, he wanted to help some Mongolian monks who had gone into exile, because they had a different category, which they were received by the Indian government at that time in a different way than the Tibetans were, because they thought of them as Russians or something, you know, because they came from Kalmykia or Buryatia or somewhere. So it was a little bit, they had a harder time, and he wanted to go and help them financially and so on. So he said, I'll take you, and then I'll introduce you to Dalai Lama. Maybe he'll make you a monk. I'll leave it up to him, he said. But then when he introduced me to His Holiness, and he mentioned it like this, and I already spoke Tibetan, by that time. And then I'd been with him almost 2 years, and then learning Tibetan, and there were several other monks there, and I was good in languages at that age. And he then says to His Holiness, well, he's very desperate to be a monk. He's really good in the philosophy and study already, etc. He's a little crazy, like Westerners can be, but he's very smart and he's very sincere about Buddhism, and he desperately wants to be a monk. But my advice, Your Holiness, is don't make him a monk. He says, it was so said. I even turned, I said, what do you say? You want to be a monk? Now you're saying don't make him a monk. So he says, don't make him a monk. I predict he will, be difficult for him in his homeland and back in New York. And of course, His Holiness hadn't traveled the world then, this was 1960, 64. He hadn't traveled the world. So he didn't really know the conditions. And so he didn't know quite what the old Mongolian was saying. But it would be hard for me. And then the old Mongolian gentleman said, well, you decide, you're the Dalai Lama. I'm just an old Mongolian monk, he says. So then that was that. And then His Holiness took me under his wing. And after about a year of study and so on, his tutor ordained me as a mendicant novice, Shramaneri. And then His Holiness included me in a batch to be bhikshu, what they call upasampada, fully ordained or fully graduated, literally is what upasampada really means, not ordained. And because I said, ordainment and order and obedience is not a big thing for Buddhist monks, unlike Western ones. So anyway, I did, and I only lasted another year and a half or about 2 years more. And then finally, I came to the realization, to my huge embarrassment, in late 1966, that really it was not possible for me to sort of carry an enlightening message to my peers and colleagues in America as a shaven-headed, red-robed monk,
Right.
of someone who they expected to, if not being a GI, at least being a regular American layperson in the Protestant Essex Society, where
Right.
they might understand the monkhood. Even among Catholics, they don't quite understand it. And I finally realized it was kind of a sociological reason that the old Mongolian had been that way. And then that was very embarrassing. And it took His Holiness a few years, because we were kind of buddies by then. But it took him a few years to sort of decide that, well, maybe it wasn't such a total disaster. It took him a little while.
I see.
But he's so kind and nice anyway. He didn't. But he did take it a little personally, actually, since I was the first,
Right.
And I had a number of emissaries coming to me saying, well, you can always go back, which technically you can't do in Tibetan tradition, once you quit being a monk. But on the other hand, exceptions have been made to a few Tibetans who dropped their vows and their robes for a while, or offered up the robes for a while due to the exile circumstances, but then at older age asked to return, and that there have been exceptions made like that.
Right.
But I did not. I became responsible for a family and so forth, and professor's life and the whole thing.
Indeed.
And
Indeed.
great grandchildren even.
Yeah. You are regarded as the most important articulator of Tibetan Buddhist ideas in America, and perhaps even beyond. What are the fundamentals that attract you to it?
Well, I don't necessarily agree to that moniker of being the most important. I don't think it does any good except attract jealousy.
Fair enough.
I do my best because I see it, like His Holiness knocked my socks off when he arrived in America after 1979. In 1979, finally got past the Kissinger-Brzezinski blockade, you could say, thanks to Cyrus Vance and Jimmy Carter, and started coming. And he said he wasn't bringing Buddhism in a big way here. He was bringing the common human religion of kindness.
Right.
And this was still in a period where I was only 15 years in my relationship with him. And he was always telling me that if I had been brought up as a Christian, since it was legal in a pluralistic culture to make different religious or spiritual choices, he couldn't fault me completely, but he said, at least I should absolutely appreciate Christianity and never be, disparaging about it and this kind of thing. He was very, very firm about it, and I didn't quite understand quite why everybody shouldn't be a Buddhist, because I was enjoying being a Buddhist so much. And I did finally click around the time he started basically being in the West, and I saw his absolute determination not to convert anybody, where he would always give prefaces to his lectures in a non-Buddhist audience, or maybe a few Buddhists, but I mean mostly non-Buddhists, where he would say, I want you to know I never have a motive of trying to talk about some Buddhist knowledge or practice or any such thing to someone who isn't a Buddhist with a motive of them being a Buddhist. I think it's all right to learn some meditation technique or some this or that, or even deal with some philosophical or theological theories learn that about Buddhism, but not be a Buddhist. And as a Christian or as a secular humanist, for that matter, he always considered secular humanism a kind of world religion. In fact, he always did. And, with his open-mindedness and non-dogmatic way of being, I thought. So I didn't quite get, it took me about 20 years to drop which was lucky, because I became an academic teacher where you don't proselytize in the academy. But in the process of learning how to be like that, which I didn't sincerely became like that, it was at his inspiration about how it's wrong to think that the denomination is the key thing for people, just the name, and just shouting out "I'm" for whoever it is. And rather, it's however they have changed their own personality. And then, of course, I discovered in Ashoka's wonderful things where he said the key thing is to convert yourself to the highest spiritual ideals of your own tradition.
Right.
In Ashoka's own determination to support not just the Buddhist Sangha, but also the Brahmins and also the Jains and also everybody else, And they never liked the Charvakas, the materialists, but the Dalai Lama proudly says about India, they still called the Charvaka guy, even though he was a Lokayata, they still called him a rishi,
Right.
even though disagreed with him.
Right. Indeed, that's true. How have you approached the idea of anitya or impermanence in your daily life, especially when it comes to issues such as the future of Tibet or the Dalai Lama's institution? Because impermanence is the fundamental aspect of Buddhism.
Of course it is. Things are always changing. Any institution that persists because of its continuing usefulness, it's changing all the time. Impermanence means. And one day it will fulfill it. If it fulfills its purpose, it will come to an end. And if it fails in its purpose, it will come to an end. So in the larger, that is the case. And in a way, I think I always sensed, and I was a little bit not so popular in the Save Tibet or Liberate Tibet movement, although I believe it should be liberated, and it is in a way ultimately liberated, which is why the CCP goes into such contortions to pretend that it never existed, like Putin pretending there never was such a thing as the Ukraine. It's the last resort. That's the last resort of colonialists, and in that kind of a case. And so I do believe that. But on the other hand, I always said that Tibet will not be free until the world system changes. And even when I initially used to say that, I didn't quite realize what is very clear to me today, which is that colonialism is clearly not over. It's still continuing. And we can find it everywhere. We find it in Palestine. We find it with the Uyghur people. We find it in various it was going on in Syria, actually, where the minority controlled the majority, which was because that's the way the French drew the lines and the English drew the line, where the Kurds, who are a nation, the Kurds totally in all four countries are more populous than the whole of Iraq, including the Iraqi Kurds. And it so therefore totally deserves being its own nation, the Kurds, and they're persecuted by four different other nationalities rather badly, and also they became supreme smugglers, which was a bonus. But the point is that I only discovered recently that in late 1940s, after founding UN, that the powers that be in the UN forced any African country or Asian country that wanted to join as a free nation they had to keep the boundaries imposed on them by the colonialists, which always included a minority on top of a majority, which is the colonial system, so that the colonial power defends the minority against the majority. And then when there's no colonial power, then the majority is likely to persecute the minority. And this has been happening ever since. And so it all has to do with and then the communists, of course, were total, like USSR, my Ukrainian friends call it the Romanov 2.0.
Yes.
As we're now in the Romanov 3.0, which is now trying to destroy the Ukraine. And not only that, but has other aspirations as well. Georgia, Moldova, I mean, you name it. Anything that was once within the Soviet Empire should be back again in the Romanov 3.0. So the whole story is colonialism has to actually stop. And people have to face up to that fact. And different local groups, it's also ecologically essential, they have the determining voice in what is done in their area, because far off capitals do not really understand the ecology of a local area, and they will make decisions. The archetypal one was Brezhnev's desiccation of the Aral Sea in order to drain off the rivers to have a higher cotton crop in other provinces. And that's simply not possible nowadays, So the federational level of things has to become more genuine in many areas, which means an unraveling of the colonial system. And in that, then a sensible Beijing administration would want to federate with a semi or a truly autonomous Republic of Tibet, where the Tibetans would say how much destruction they want locally of their forests, how many dams they want, how much population they want, even creating therefore city areas that raise the temperature, destroying the permafrost and the glaciers in their rivers, which affects 2 billion people downstream in all directions, in the case of Tibet. And then every, like Inner Mongolia, Uiguria, Ukraine, all of these places have to have their more local self-determination. And indeed, the principle of self-determination has to be returned and reestablished as a human right, as was intended in the founding of the UN and so on. And that is not the case now. Human rights specialists, even I've been told by professional human rights people over the years, oh, no, we can't include self-determination as a human right, or we could never get anywhere with all these governments,
Right.
Because the governments are still oppressing some minorities somewhere, and they don't want self-determination.
Right. Just last 2 or 3 points, Professor. One is I want to draw your attention to what the great scholar Ananda Kumaraswamy writes in his book, Buddha and the Gospel of Buddhism. I'm going to quote a little passage from it.
Okay, great. He's wonderful. Art historian also. Mm-hmm.
He says, and I'm quoting him now, the doctrine of the mean asserts that everything is a becoming, a flux without beginning or end. There exists no static moment when this becoming attains.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that is profound.
It is.
And then he talks about, strictly speaking, the life of a living being is exceedingly brief, lasting only while a thought lasts.
That's right. Exactly.
Now, that's a splendid view. What is your take on that?
Well, I think that's absolutely correct. What they call coarse wisdom or knowledge of impermanence is knowing that you are going to die, I am going to die, everyone dies, and therefore deals with what that is, what that means, and also it also deals with the fact that nothingness doesn't exist, and therefore there's always going to be something else, and therefore life is beginningless. We've had infinite previous lives, all of us, not just Buddha, and we will have interminable future ones, which then gives a much heavier weight to our behavior, what I call karmic behavior, but what I call evolutionary behavior, in this life, which includes mind behavior and speech behavior, as well as physical behavior, contrary to materialism. So I think that's a very accurate and wonderful idea and law. And what it brings to mind, a wonderful thing, I'm a good friend of a gentleman named Robert Swoboda, who is the first American ever to be licensed in Pune as an Indian Ayurvedic doctor, and in India with many patients, and he's retired now. But he's came from Houston, Texas. Has a Czech name, but he's American. And but he's a good Sanskritist, and he loves India, of course. And I hadn't really brought it in my mind the word dravya in Sanskrit, which means substance. I don't know if it's the same word in Hindi, but it means substance. But dravya comes from a verb, dru, which means to flow or to melt.
Right.
So it actually has even the word for what we think of something static and permanent, like a fixed substance. In the Indian language, ancient Indian scientific language, not just some spiritual thing, but scientific language, in ancient Indian science, and therefore in Indian language, it means something which is flowing, which is changing.
Right.
Like rocks are lava, which flows, when they're heating up, even a solid rock. So I think that is very much not just the Buddhist idea, but it's basically Indian inner science, which, by the way, His Holiness, in his what he calls, actually in his best formulation, he calls it his third aim in life. Although lately he has come to say, before that he used to say fourth aim, but his third aim in life, or fourth aim, whichever way he's putting it, is his duty to India,
Right.
to Tibet, for their kindness of having sheltered the Tibetan exiles now for 60 years. About 60 years, a little more than that. And he says his body is more made of rice and dal than it is of Tibetan dumplings.
Indeed. That is true.
In honor of that, he has no intention of seeking to convert Hindu Indians to Buddhism. Absolutely not.
Yeah.
But he does want to help Indian Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, whoever they are, or Sikhs, or whoever it is, to reinforce ancient Adhyatma Vidya, the inner science, especially the psychologies of the yoga tradition, the Vedanta tradition, the Buddhist tradition, the Jaina tradition, to sort of hold its own with Western materialistic science and with Western psychology, which he considers kind of a beginning psychology, since it's only a century or so old, a couple of centuries maximum old. And then, although I think it's older than that in the old Catholic monasteries, the monks were good psychologists, but in a secular world, only a couple of centuries. Whereas for India, it's thousands of years old, the nature of the mind, which is why India developed the wonderful traditions of yoga. And so, rather than anybody else. And so he's very strong on that. And I myself am very much into that nowadays. Vidya, And I'm very pleased that my dear friend Deepak Chopra, recently has been calling himself an Adhyatma Vidyavan.
Okay. Yeah.
The ancient psychology,
Right.
And I really like that.
I'm going to quote you now. You said you can't enter into the ideal universe of enjoyment, wisdom, and compassion, the Buddha world, as I like to call it, until you first detach yourself from the world of suffering, this prison that is the fixed and absolute self-image. Explain that to me.
Okay. Well, yes. I'm not sure of the context myself or when I said that, but what I would be referring to is that both Western religions and Western science, modern Western science, present a view to people, and I think, in fact, all in history, Western and Eastern societies have generally tended, when they're authoritarian, to present the world as a scary place to people. Even the secularists talk about nature is red in tooth and claw, blood red in tooth and claw. Nature as a dangerous place. The scientists, if you watch one of those, like, the history of the planet, where it starts in the exploding sun and then the moon explodes out of the earth and then all these rocks are bashing against one another and then supernova awaits. We're awaiting supernova, this kind of thing. They made a very scary. Then you have dinosaurs chasing each other around, and then the saber-toothed tiger, and then this and that. And we have, of course, everybody has their Pentagon and their nuclear weapons. And so that's a scary world. And then in the theistic world, God, they say, oh yeah, God is good, yeah, Allah al-Rahman, oh, God is compassionate indeed. But then you're having Holocaust, you're having horrible things, you have hells, you're sent to hell if you don't obey. It's like really pretty scary also.
Right.
And the point of that is to get people to be obedient and fearing nature, world fearing, so that they will obey the rules, that the king and the high priest want them to obey, and not strike out to sort of make their own decisions about things, and not be too free. Even in democracy, we say yes, free, but then they scare us with nature being scary. So we need this drug or that thing or that restriction of the state or whatever, and we need a big military budget because the neighbors are out to kill us and so on. So that's what I mean by the world of suffering. I don't just mean the first noble truth.
Okay.
And so when we feel that the default reality, except for some exceptional person where Jesus has saved you after all the bad things you did, or where Krishna comes and loves you, and even though you don't deserve it, or where Buddha, someone puts you in a Buddha land, even though you're a terrible, ignorant being. In other words, someone may be set to save you later, and meanwhile, the government is saving you, and or the high priest and the temple is presenting you with the option of being saved. But meanwhile, you're scared, and you go through life scared.
Right.
So the Buddha world is much more positive. And actually, I think in general, the Indian culture world has also experienced a shock where it's like that. I mean, after all, the Krishna of the Mahabharata is a bit of a warmonger. In fact, not necessarily of the Gita in its final form,
Right.
but the early form, Krishna really is egging on the Pandavas and the Kauravas to destroy each other and bring on Kali Yuga. And then, but the Bhagavatam Krishna is Mr. Baby, much more powerful than Jesus, and he's in love with everybody, and everybody loves him, and bhakti is flowing.
Right.
So that's a huge change in spiritual history, where they have, kind of, and the idea of they're not waiting. They are waiting for Kalki, maybe 10th avatar Vishnu, but they have a much more sense of the benevolence of the gods and less fear of hell, I think, than the Westerners do. And so what I'm saying, the Buddha vision, especially in the Mahayana Sutras, and even in Theravada, where it's not that hard to achieve nirvana actually in one life, however they define it, but it's quite doable. You join and become a bhikshu, and you put your effort into that, and you can attain nirvana. And the Mahayana, it's a bit more hard because you have to bring the whole world with you, which is hard to understand how you could do that. But on the other hand, there is this possibility of becoming completely free and so on. So that's what I say. The Buddha world relates to shifting your view of things to a positive default reality. And in a way, what modernity is, the appeal of materialistic modernity has actually used that kind of idea itself, because the lack of a future life, which is supposedly authorities at Harvard or MIT will tell you, like, that's a discovered fact, which of course it absolutely isn't.
Right.
It's their own fake way of selling dispensations, like Martin Luther was mad at the Catholics for selling tickets to heaven. In a way, the scientists sell you a ticket to the heaven of infinite and eternal anesthesia,
Right.
with no future pain. Maybe it's boring and there's no Star Wars and there's no ice cream cones and there's no rice and dal, and there's no sex. But who needs it when you don't even know that you exist?
Right.
And you don't remember that you once used to have a few moments of fun in life,
Right.
which were usually sinful or doing something wrong, and you might get punished for later, you're all told. So don't have too much fun. So the point is, they're selling a consequence-free future with their existentialism and the whole thing. And they found a willing adopting market for that. So which has led to a global recklessness where we're letting them get away with destroying the whole planet to make more money selling their oil and coal and gas and crap. I mean, there's no reason for us to do that. We can see the effect. We can see the destructiveness. We can lose our home in any flood or fire or whatever it is. And yet we still don't really politically put the stop to it, as we the numbers to do it if we really were determined to do it. So this last bastion of the materialists, pretending to people that whatever they happen, it ultimately won't matter, which then condones their selfish behavior and reckless behavior in our delicate environment, is a very big, huge danger to us all. And if we can come back to the Indian middle way of interconnectedness, and of happy, jolly lover boy gods, and nice angels, and Hanuman saving us from the bad guys, and so on. And that's really nice. And I believe that's the soul of India, has that happiness in it.
It is, yeah.
And that's why India likes democracy and openly, and why now India, I'm hoping, will help America restore and will prevent. I don't think it can happen here. I don't think that what they're trying will succeed, but it's very, very dangerous right now about all. Right. I want to go into that in a moment. But so that's what I would say. I forgot the question, though.
No, you answered it. To conclude, Professor, Buddhism is rather matter of fact about death. There is no sentimentalism attached to that. Given that it's going to happen to all of us,
yes,
including the Dalai Lama, the inevitable, how do you, as a friend of nearly 60 years,
more than 60,
his passing and your passing, how do you look at that?
Well, the thing is, the point is, we're not, the reason they do actually make a fuss about death, in the sense that there's lots of rituals and things for longevity and methodology to develop longevity. And the Tibetan Ayurveda version, or the Buddhist Ayurveda version, which is more or less just like Ayurveda, is very much big. Ayur means long life, lifespan. So it's very much into that. But on the other hand, we inevitably will face death, and it's considered a healthy thing in life to be aware of the imminence of death and the momentary possibility of it. You could swallow the wrong fish bone if you were eating fish and choke to death in a minute, or be run over by a truck or whatever. I mean, it could happen. And being aware of that is considered energizing and vivifying of life, rather than morbid and something you should hide from yourself. And so therefore, death is just like walking through a doorway. What's most important is what's on the other side, and therefore what to do, how to navigate that. It's just like, it's no big deal to fall asleep, but the question is, what sort of dream are you going to have, and how good a deep sleep you're going to have, and how much REM sleep are you going to have, and then how energized will you be tomorrow? That's the key thing. It's not a fear of falling asleep, in other words. So this is not seen in a large sense as a state of some sort of ghost-like suspended animation, except or even nothingness. It's not seen as that. So it's simply a doorway to a bigger reality, in fact. And if you think life is very, very dangerous, then you're scared, because you're scared of what might happen afterwards, not of death itself. And if you have some silly idea that you're going to be nothing, then of course in a way, you're only scared of not prolonging your pleasure, and you want to do euthanasia if you're starting to feel a lot of pain in your older age, because then you get into that anesthesia that you falsely assume will be waiting for you in nothing. But I always have a thing I like to say in any interview or any public thing is, newsflash. Thousands of years ago, the Buddha, Mahavira, Patanjali, Badarayana, the great rishis, they all came up with a wonderful insight, which is that nothing is exactly nothing.
True.
So it's not a destination, and it's unscientific to imagine that you'll land in nothing. It is not a discovery. Nobody will ever discover it. It's a word for what you will never discover. And therefore, you always have to count on something else. And therefore, you have to prepare for it, which we pragmatically do. And what's so brilliant about that in the Indian context, and actually the world religions also have that to a degree, but they don't make it a sort of scientific thing, so people don't necessarily believe in it. But to a degree, they have the idea that what you do now will determine the excellence or misery of what follows after you pass from this body. And so that's a very important thing to constrain your conscience and your ethical self-interest, if you will.
Right.
And rather than, Robert Nozick at Harvard or other kinds of ethicists, what they call philosophical ethicists, go on and on existentially about how it doesn't matter what you do ultimately, but so you have to choose it within a relative framework. But that we can see that is not strong enough to really constrain people when push comes to shove. Selfishness can reassert itself uncontrollably when they all think it doesn't matter, except for some immediate consequence.
Right.
So I think that's a really important point, that nothing is nothing, and we have to cope with that. And then we will enter not just the Buddhist, but the Indian mind, and actually Western spiritual ones as well, in a more graphic way, where it will actually influence how we behave.
Right. When did you last interact with him?
With His Holiness? Oh,
Yeah.
last time I saw His Holiness was in March, and we had a really nice moment. We had a cuddle and a really nice moment, as we always do. Although nowadays it's reached the point where, oh, you're still alive. And I hadn't started growing this beard.
Otherwise, he would have pulled it.
He did recognize me very quickly. And he went on and on about home. He was very focused. I think he had just lost his elder brother,
Right.
And I think he was thinking about family. So when he met a really old friend, it sort of associated the time when he had his family. So he kept talking about home. And people who overheard him saying that, who were there in the audience, they said, oh, he's saying, isn't that sweet? He's saying that you're home here in Dharamsala. And I think, though, that, which I felt very nicely, and it was very nice. And because I did live there quite a bit, and I love that place. It's like, to me, it's the Gandharva Nagara. It's the city of angels or city of fairies. And so I love it. I love it there. Although I'm worried about it in an earthquake, but I do love it otherwise. And then on the other hand, later I decided it fit with a dream I had when I was in a dream where he and I were performing some ceremony, and everything was really beautiful, and it was lovely and whatever. And then some message came to me in the dream saying, you must come back to New York. We have to do something about Tibet House, this and that, which is the nonprofit in New York that I am responsible for at his request, which is the cultural center, his sort of representation of Tibetan culture, what we call a kind of a cultural embassy for a nation that's not supposed to exist. Right? But it's a cultural embassy. And then I said in the dream, I said, no, I don't want to go. I'm staying here. And then he stops the ceremony, whatever he was chanting, and he turns to me in the dream and says, no, you have to go. You go do that work. Go do that. And I said, no, I don't want to. I said to him. And then he said to me, and then he said, well, why not? You could. I said, I don't want to because I like to do this, whatever we were doing, some sort of colorful sort of mandala or something. And then he says, well, you can do this at home, he said. And I said, yeah, no, but I don't want to. I like to do it with you, I said, in the dream. So then we get into because we were kind of schoolmates way back 62 years ago. He was still in his 20s also, but he's 5-6 years older. And he was an older pupil student. And so we kind of have that way of talking, like a little bit. And so, and then he says to me, he says, after all these years, you don't know that I'm with you always? Like a sort of harsh refutation, like they do in the Tibetan debate,
Right.
Clap. And then I woke up,
Oh.
So when he was saying home, I think what he was saying to me was, stay home.
Right.
I love it being home here, and I don't want to go anywhere from Dharamsala. Because he doesn't want to. He doesn't really. He likes to stay in his room. He does a little exercise there. He has a therapist. He's 90. He had that knee operation. And he had to do a lot of rehab. He has rehab, and he can be online in front of thousands or tens of thousands of people, and he can give his message to them when he wants. and he can read his books, which he loves, his beautiful Tibetan poetical and philosophical books. And home is great. He's encouraging because he knows it's at my age. I'm only 84, but at my age, long travel like that is arduous.
It is.
So when he was saying home, home, when I met him in March, I was thinking he was saying that it's good to be. He was sharing with me how good it is to be home. And I was invited by the IBC to Delhi on July 13th to some sort of thing in the Ashok Hotel having to do with the 90th birthday. But I just can't make it, It's just too long a journey and one day. And I'm sending a video instead,
Okay, I see. Yeah.
It's too much. So I'm staying home.
Indeed. On that note, Dr. Thurman, I want to thank you very much for your time. It was riveting for me. You are very generous on this.
Well,
I
thank you,
appreciate that.
Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be a
No. The honor is all mine. Please don't say it. It's all me. I have taken all your honor.
You're a real scholar, and you're a beautiful biography of His Holiness, and you're a keen observer of the Tibetan issue, which I think is much more important to the world than people think. Even just the ecological level about the rivers all flowing down there out of the glaciers and the glacial lakes and things. And not only that, but the wonderful scholar, the glaciologist Martin Mills, points out it's not just the glaciers, it's the permafrost up there.
Right.
That's getting disrupted now, and that'll have an enormous impact on China's own ecology. Of course, Burma, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and India, and Pakistan. Totally.
Yeah.
Between monsoons, if there's a trickle, because there are no more glaciers, there's only a trickle of usable water down all those rivers. We're talking global crisis.
Absolutely.